past 2 weeks, we at CNBC TV18 have been raising this issue of reimagining public sector banks. And on Wednesday, Governor Urjit Patel did just that. In one of his most plain-speaking speeches, he said, and I quote, "RBI's regulatory powers over public sector banks are weaker than those over private sector banks," unquote. So, how should the government go about fixing this problem? To discuss that today, I have with me a person who rarely gives interviews, let alone television interviews. He's best placed to answer these questions because he started his career as a public sector banker and went on to become the founder of India's largest private sector bank. My guest is N Vaghul, the founder of ICICI Bank. Mr. Vaghul, you know that there are these problems of NPAs and one fraud at Punjab National Bank. It is in this context that the Governor, Urjit Patel, while speaking, said that, just to simplify, that if such a problem of fraud had risen in a private sector bank, he could have removed the board, superseded the board, removed the CEO. But when it comes to public sector banks, he cannot remove the board, he cannot remove the managing director, he cannot supersede the board. Do you think that's a fair charge, that RBI doesn't have enough regulatory powers over public sector banks?
On this particular issue, I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever that the mess that has been created today in the banking sector is to a large extent owes itself to the fact that the banks have been under the public sector for 50 long years without any improvement whatsoever in their working. And I think Urjit Patel has hit the problem right on its head.
Mr. Vaghul, you were there in State Bank of India. I think were you executive assistant to R.K. Talwar at the time of nationalization? Was this the intent, that RBI should not have or should have truncated regulatory powers? Was this the intent of nationalization bank? Is it that the intent has gotten corrupted, or is the act itself a problem?
No, I was attended the first meeting of the public sector bank's chairman the day after the nationalization of the banks. In fact, they all assembled in the State Bank's boardroom, and Mr. L.K. Jha was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India. I was barely 33 at that time, and I was sitting as the secretary of the coordination committee, and I was taking notes of the meeting. Mr. Jha started off his speech with a statement that the nationalization won't make any difference whatsoever in the way in which the banks are functioning. And as far as the government is concerned, the government will be just like any other shareholder. And there will not be a dual center of power. And the commercial banks will have to look to the Reserve Bank of India as the sole regulatory and supervisory authority.
Okay.
And only in matters of public policy, if the government wants to issue a directive, it will issue a directive to Reserve Bank of India. And Reserve Bank of India will be the only organization which the commercial banks will have to look into. I think in the same breath he said, I don't know whether he said it in the meeting or separately in a meeting with Mr. Talwar, which I happened to attend, that he had been promised that there will not be a Department of Banking. And because the Department of Banking will go against the very spirit of the nationalization of the dual control. I think precisely the terminology which Mr. Urjit Patel has raised now, Mr. Jha raised at that particular point of time.
Okay. Well, actually, yeah, go ahead,
Mr.
sir.
Jha is not the only person who raised this issue. About 10 years earlier, 1959, there was a Mandra scam. And Mandra scam was investigated by Chagla Commission.
Yes. And
just took 24 days to investigate, and then Mr. Krishnamachari resigned as the finance minister. And government appointed a Supreme Court justice by name
Chagla.
Vivian Bose. I think I would like to quote, if you don't mind that report, which, not Chagla, it is Vivian Bose, was the justice of the Supreme Court. I think it fits into the present position. He says it's unfortunate that the sensation surrounding the transaction has led public interest towards apportioning individual blame and away from the more important issues regarding the autonomy of public corporations and ministerial responsibility. The expansion of public sector in the country is bound to bring to the fore the problem of the forms of corporate ownership like nationalization, if the dangers of centralization and concentration of power are to be avoided, the efficient working of autonomous corporations established along functional and regional lines will assume particular importance. One more sentence I will add. It is to be hoped when the reports are debated in Parliament, they will be lesser concerned with allocation of blame and more attention will be paid to securing safeguards for the free functioning of the autonomous public corporations. This question is of concern to all modern states which are tending to be leviathans. And it is of particular importance to our country where the politicians have only recently tasted the heady wine of power and where we have as yet no strong tradition of independent corporate bodies which form the core of pluralistic society. I think it fits in absolutely to the present situation.
Yes.
I see no, I mean, to me it's a blessing in disguise, this fraud. They should open up the larger issue of government ownership of banks. I think one more important lesson from the past, Mr. Narasimhan was appointed as the chairman of the Banking Commission in 1991. That's about 27 years back. And I happened to be a member of that commission. And there was a debate in that whether we should privatize the public sector banks. And almost all the members were unanimous in their opinion that banks will have to be privatized. But Mr. Narasimhan wrote out a very interesting piece in that commission's report. One is, it is not about the ownership of the banks that is important. It is the level of control of the government over the banks that is important. And he said that it doesn't matter if the government retains the ownership of the banks, so long as they assure that they voluntarily abdicate their control functions over the banks in favor of the Reserve Bank of India. I think this is coming in handy today.
Well, sir, it's beautifully quoted your both the prescience with which Justice Vivian Bose made that observation and Mr. Narasimhan's quote that you are quoting from memory. But now, sir, how do we bring this to the present scenario? Do you think that we could retain the legislative framework but merely abolish the banking department and go ahead? Or do you think the law needs to change?
Yeah, in fact, I would go for a very strong measure. I mean, you may say that I'm pretty old and I can take a very radical view of this matter. But in 1991, Mr. Narasimhan did contemplate the idea that the government's ownership of, government's control over the banks are no longer justifiable. If the government's control over the banks are no longer justifiable, I don't see any logic for the banking department to continue to function. I think the Reserve Bank of India should be the sole and only authority in order to supervise and regulate the banks. And I saw today a statement by Bimal Jalan, who said that if public sector banks are privatized, who will lend to agriculture and small-scale industries? I think for 50 long years we have been lending. And private sector banks are also obligated to lend to the priority sector, which consists of agriculture and small-scale industries. That is no longer the problem. The problem today is what Urjit Patel has said, that the duality of control will have to go. And if this, ultimately in the PNB fraud, those who perpetrated the fraud, those who facilitated the fraud, those who had knowledge of the fraud or ought to have known the fraud existed, will have to be dealt with. But the larger issue of where does it lead us to, the larger issue of the autonomy of the public sector banks, I mean, that I think will have to be raised to the fore. Instead of merely going on debating as to whom should be blamed for this, whether the Reserve Bank of India should have known about this, should have prevented this. Such questions are no longer relevant. I think we should confine our issue that those who are guilty will have to be punished. And move along in it. How are we going to stop such issues from coming up to the fore in the future? The only way in which you can stop it is to give that autonomy to the public sector institutions and have the right people there. And the only persons who can decide who are the right people must be the Reserve Bank of India. It can't be a whole lot of people.
Mr. Vaghul, I have to take a very quick commercial break. I'm back in a jiffy, sir. We are just warming up. I have lots more questions for you.